What if I told you that the West is declining not because of decadence, nihilism, or any of the other commonly cited causes, but because we have forgotten the ancient secret of the Eleusinian Mysteries? You'd likely look at me quite strangely and wonder, what is this schizo talking about? But let me explain. When I speak of Christianity or paganism on this channel, I'm not referring to the worship of specific gods. I'm talking about worldviews. Just as Christ is attached to an entire worldview, a value system, an understanding of life, the role of the body and the soul, and the role of morality, the same applies when I speak of the pagan worldview. The understanding of life found in the ancient Greek Eleusinian mystery cult is the key to understanding the ancient European pagan worldview, I believe. And I believe that it is our increasing amnesia of this worldview that is causing the decline of the West. The Homeric hymn to Demeter tells us about the mythological origin of the Eleusinian Mysteries and hints at their meaning. In the hymn to Demeter, Hades abducts Persephone to be his wife with the consent of her father Zeus and brings her to the underworld. The loss of her daughter sends Demeter into a state of grief and rage, and she makes the earth infertile, threatening to kill off all of humanity if her daughter is not returned to her. And because of this, Zeus allows Persephone to return to her mother. But since Persephone ate of the fruit of the underworld, she must stay with her husband, Hades, for a third of every year, during which the plants will wilt and the earth will become infertile. Persephone's consumption of the pomegranate seed, which Hades quote-unquote forcefully put into her, also signifies, I believe, Persephone's loss of virginity, and permanently marries her to death, to Hades. Thus, all of nature is perpetually trapped in a cycle of seasonal fertility and infertility, death and rebirth, wilting and flowering. Demeter's last words to Persephone in the hymn seem to strike at the essence of the mysteries. Quote, "When the earth sprouts with every kind of fragrant flower in the spring, out of the misty darkness you will rise again, a great marvel for gods and mortal folk." End quote. In this myth, Persephone represents the rebirth of life out of death, and particularly the seasonal rebirth of vegetative life, of plant life, which more generally symbolizes the immortality of life despite the death of the individual organism. Each season, Persephone must journey into the earth, into the house of death, and with her the plants wilt and are covered by the earth. But each season, Persephone returns again from the house of the dead, and the plants sprout forth again from the earth. And so it is with men. Each generation, men die and are swallowed by the earth, but each generation, new life is also born through reproduction. Though Persephone, like mortals, is bound to death, through death there is also rebirth, just as surely as spring follows winter. I believe that in both the Dionysian and Eleusinian mysteries, one would connect with the immortality of biological life. Let's take Dionysus. He is a god of theater, wine, madness, all things that involve the shedding of the self, of the ego, and giving way to a primal force, stepping outside of oneself. And it seems that the mysteries would involve shedding individual identity, perhaps with the use of psychedelic drinks or just wine, and connecting with the immortal, primal life force. Thus we get a picture of life as an intergenerational, biological force, reborn in nature each season and among men each generation, despite the death of the individual organism. A divine force that flows through you, and which is also the essence of the immortal gods, who are eternally youthful. And with this view of life, we can see why descent and ancestry was so important to the European pagans. The Greek heroes and aristocratic ruling families claimed descent from the gods. The heroes were conceived of as the kin of the gods, overflowing with this vital life force and all its signatures: beauty, power, grace, athleticism, wit, vitality. And this is why worshipping the ancestors was also so important. From the idea of life as a chain, an intergenerational force, comes the notion that we can strive to strengthen and improve life. Each generation, men can become weaker, baser, cruder, in a certain sense less alive, possessing less of that vital spirit that renders one full of beauty, power, and strength like the gods. Or men can become more like the gods, who rule over man like an aristocratic caste, representing the highest ideals of their culture. Nietzsche speaks of this in Human, All Too Human. Quote, "The Greeks did not look upon the Homeric gods above them as lords, nor upon themselves beneath as servants, as it is among the Jews. They saw but the counterpart, as in a mirror of the most perfect specimens of their own caste, hence an ideal, but no contradiction of their own nature. There was a feeling of mutual relationship, resulting in a mutual interest, a sort of alliance. Man thinks well of himself when he gives himself such gods, and places himself in a relationship akin to that of the lower nobility with the higher." End quote. Nietzsche then goes on to contrast this view with the Christian notion that man is fallen, vulgar, base, sinful, and in need of redemption. At the end of this video, I'm going to talk about a form of Christianity that fits into the pagan Eleusinian worldview. But first we have to discuss how traditional Christian theology contradicts and inverts the pagan view. In Christian theology, the soul, the essence of the individual, is immortal, while the body is dying. When Paul says in 1 Corinthians that the body will be shed and give birth to a spiritual body, just as a seed gives birth to a shaft of wheat, it is my suspicion that he was using this grain metaphor to implicitly reference the Eleusinian Mysteries, which would have been very well known in the Greek diaspora during his time. But whether or not this is the case, we can see that the Christian conception of the soul as the true, undying body, the true source of life, is an inversion of the Eleusinian conception, in which the body, biology, contains the spark of immortality, while the soul, the individual, is dying. In the Christian conception, the soul is what is most real and true, while the body passes away, and immortality is found in heaven, not on earth, not in biology. In the Greek view, there is an afterlife for the shade, but one's shade is just that, a pale reflection of earthly life. And even if one reaches Valhalla or Elysium, what is most important is that one's memory is preserved among men, passed from generation to generation, continually renewed, continually reborn with each telling of the hero's deeds. Christianity places its emphasis on the salvation of the soul. The actions of the individual reflect on the soul and determine whether, in death, they will meet a fiery eternity in hell or a blessed one in heaven. Thus, the world on a metaphysical level becomes a moral struggle between good and evil, and emphasis is shifted onto the individual and their salvation, and away from collective responsibility to the chain of life, away from family, tribe, and so on. In this view, it becomes impossible to improve man through each generation, to become more like the gods. The arc of history is in the hands of God, and man can only be improved through the salvation of his soul. The virtues of the world, then, beauty, strength, youth, vitality, may be useful, but will ultimately be shed with the body. At best, they are vain, and at worst, they are the workings of the devil, since this world should be in service to God, and the body to the spirit. But, as I've spoken about at length on this channel, the pagan worldview, the native European worldview, was not fully erased when Christianity came to Europe. This worldview still strongly influenced European societies, perhaps even until the mid-1900s. And in the last video, I discussed how the combination of this worldview with Christianity created the contradictions that led to liberalism. In liberalism, Christianity is secularized and further individualized, and the pagan worldview is almost completely lost. Everything becomes about the individual, who has no responsibility to the chain of life or any great civilizational project. You can see this type of thinking all across the West today, especially in our leaders. The British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, feels no obligation to the British people or the British civilizational project, no obligation to those who will come after him or those who came before. In fact, he actively seeks to dismantle, to deconstruct, to break down Britain's ethnic and cultural heritage. Across the West, instead of the drive towards intergenerational civilizational projects and a feeling of responsibility to one's ancestors and kin and those who will come after, we see the drive to break apart these things. The common attitude is that all collective identities should be broken down to further free the individual, and this is where nihilism stems from on a practical level. If I am mortal and I have no responsibility to anything beyond myself, I might as well indulge in as much pleasure and self-gratification as I can while I'm still alive. Who cares if those after me suffer, or if I squander the gifts of those who came before? Why bother to have kids? Why bother to defend anything or build anything? Nietzsche recognized this problem and posited the idea of the Übermensch as its antidote, a great intergenerational project, the aim of which is to overcome man himself and create something higher. Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch was doubtless influenced by the Greek idea of the demigod, as well as evolutionary thinking. The Übermensch will be to man as man is to the ape, and as a demigod is to a mortal. But this video isn't about Nietzsche, and I believe that the solution to the West's problems on a practical level could be as simple as remembering the ancient truth that life is an intergenerational project. We are part of a great chain of being, and we have an obligation to those who came before and those who will come after. Life is not a moral struggle that involves only the individual. We have an obligation also to the life force within us, which we received from our ancestors and will pass down to our children. We have an obligation to strive to allow life to flourish, and an obligation to love all those markers of flourishing life: beauty, youth, strength, grace, abundance. And I think that slowly this worldview is returning. Especially in Northern Europe, people are returning to their native pagan faith and realizing that they have an obligation to their culture, their heritage, to preserve and renew life and the traditions which allow that life to flourish. But of course, there are those who will agree with most of what I've said, but do not want to leave the Christian faith. And to them, I say that Christ can be interpreted in alignment with the Eleusinian tradition, as a symbol of life's endurance in spite of death, not as a symbol of the soul shedding its mortal coil, not as a movement away from the earth towards the heavens, but as a symbol of the intergenerational immortality of biological life on earth, Persephone and Dionysus in one. If you'd like to hear more about this interpretation of Christianity, you can search for the video on my channel called The Pagan Christ. At present, it may seem like an insurmountable task, but I believe that a renaissance is coming, perhaps first online, but eventually in the real world, with communities and networks. The first renaissance began in only a few cities among a few exceptional thinkers and artists. Yes, the task ahead is great, and the road is long, but I believe that it can be done. Again and again we are called back to the origins of our civilization. The West has experienced many periods of infertility before, but again and again the pagan spirit struggles to re-emerge from darkness, as it did during the Renaissance. And now I believe that a second Renaissance is coming, and perhaps this time a more permanent one. If you'd like to support my channel, this and more is what we discuss in our community, as well as how to imbue yourself with vitality. If you join, you'll also get access to a backlog of exclusive content, which I'm continually adding to. In the last few episodes, I covered the themes discussed in this video, but in much more depth and at much more length. From the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Hymn to Demeter, to Genesis and the writings of John and Paul. And I have a very exciting episode planned soon on the coming Renaissance, which I think will tie all of this together. I will leave you with these final words. When you feel that the winter is dark and never ending, think of your gods or God and whisper this to yourself. When the earth sprouts with every kind of fragrant flower in the spring, out of the misty darkness you will rise again, a great marvel for gods and mortal folk.